Teresa. I'm a member of the Nexus Marketing team and your moderator for today's panel session. Our topic for today is Don't Take It for Granted Grant Writing Best Practices in 2023. Really looking forward to this conversation, but as usual, before we jump in, I do have some quick logistics to cover. NXUnite is made in partnership with Nexus Marketing. The NXUnite mission is to make introductions that lead to lasting relationships and serve as a hub for connection in the mission driven sector. As you saw in our video on NXUnite, you can find upcoming industry events, suggested influencers to follow, trusted solutions, cost driven podcasts, and of course, panels with experts such as these lovely folks with me here today. Today's hour long panel will include time both for questions curated by my team and questions from you all, our lovely audience. At any time during the panel, please feel free to submit your questions via the questions tab. We already have a few questions submitted via registration, but we will give priority to our live audience members. So feel free to submit your questions at any time during the session, and we'll get to as many as possible during the second half. Now, if at any point you're having any technical difficulties, my colleague Anton will be in the chat as the Team NX Unite username ready to assist you the best he can. I also wanted to share that this panel is being recorded. So for those of you watching live, the recording will be sent to you via email after the session ends. So people can continue to register and access the recording after the panel. So if you have any friends in the industry you want to share this panel with, simply send them the same registration page and they will be able to access the recording. Now, finally, before I introduce today's panelists, I do want to thank you all for attending this panel, whether you're joining us live, watching the recording tomorrow, or a month from now. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today to learn from these outstanding experts who I will now finally introduce. All right. I'd like to first introduce Alice Runke, who is the president of Grant Station. Having raised over 45 million from federal, state, and private grant makers, she knows what it takes to get funded. As a former nonprofit program coordinator and director and founder of the Grant Advantage, Alice deeply understands the challenges that nonprofits face. Over the last 20 years, she worked in the trenches with hundreds of nonprofit organizations to improve their capacity to raise funds. Glad to have you, Alice.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Of course. Also with us today is Deronda Harrison, who is the founder and president of June First Firm, a grant writing firm specializing in assisting nonprofits under new leadership to transform their organization. She works to onboard and train their new grants team, reducing burnout, turnover, and lack of support. Deronda knows and understands too well why quality grant professionals are leaving nonprofits in droves and want to be a support system to properly train and onboard those new to the industry as well as more seasoned professionals. Glad to have you, Deronda.
Hi, thank you. Happy to be back.
Absolutely. Also joining us is Siobhan Richardson, who's the founder of Think and Ink Grants. She has 18 years of experience as a grant writer, nonprofit leader, and federal grants reviewer. Siobhan served as a nonprofit leader and co founded Blue Flowers organization in 2014. She gets grants for her clients at Think and Ink Grant Consulting and has successfully leveraged over 25 million in funding. So glad you could join us, Siobhan. And finally, with us today is Teresa Huff, who is the host of Grant Writing Simplified podcast and the go to expert in nonprofit strategy. She's helped nonprofits triple their funding and maximize their impact. After winning over 7 million for schools and nonprofits, she now teaches grant writers and nonprofits the strategies they need to develop millions in sustainable long-term funding. Her podcast has been downloaded in over 100 countries across 6 continents. More than 3,000 students worldwide have completed her online grant writing programs. So glad to have you, Teresa.
Great to work with you guys again, and I'm excited to be here.
Of course. Now it's finally time to hear from our panelists. And Teresa, I'll actually have you start us off with the first question. How do you identify and prioritize funding opportunities that align with the organization's missions and goals?
Mm. Well, first, it starts with getting really clear on the mission and goals, making sure that everyone on the team within the organization is on board, and then looking for grant makers that have very similar missions and are doing that type of work in the community and looking to invest in that kind of work. And with my TEDx talk, I talked about building your ROI, which is in the nonprofit world, a return on impact. And where can grant makers make the most impact by investing in you? And so building authentic relationships with them is really the key to finding those grant makers that are a good fit with your mission. And then that's where you can maximize over time and leverage those relationships to build that ongoing referral source, support network, and start to really get some authentic long-term funding and also just sustainable support.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for starting us off. Alice, I'm going to bring the same question over to you. What steps do you take in identifying funding opportunities that align with the organization's mission and goals?
Yeah, so this is really dear to what I do at Grant Station and what Grant Station is all about, helping nonprofits find those funding opportunities. So we really encourage organizations to really look at those areas of interest and the target populations they're dealing with and their geographic scope and the kinds of funding that they're looking for, the types of support, and using a system like GrantStation to find those opportunities and connect in with the funders. So it's kind of the baseline of what GrantStation is about, making those initial connections for you to find those grant makers to then develop those relationships with.
Thanks, Alice. Duranda, over to you. What's your approach for identifying funding opportunities that fit an organization's goals?
Yeah, I think you hear making sure your missions align, make sure your missions align. But what does that mean exactly? I always ask organization, is this grant funder funding the work you're currently implementing? How you're currently serving your clients? Is it a program or service that you're currently offering that they fund? So I'm just breaking it down, making it very practical for organizations, or is it work that you're going to immediately implement very soon? So just making sure that those things are what's driving your conversation with funders, your interest with funders, and not the dollar amount. You just see them, they give $250,000 over 2 years. We got to go after this. Just is making sure that it's specifically funding the work that you're currently implementing, and also making sure the funder is a good partner. Do they have unnecessary, or I won't say unnecessary, but challenging reporting requirements that just may not be a fit for your organization? Your small staff, a monthly report or even a quarterly report that's intensive may not be the best suited for your organization. So making sure that it makes sense, making sure that you're not driven by the dollar amount, and make sure that it best serves your organization.
Definitely. Thanks, Duranda. Siobhan, what's your strategy for identifying funding that aligns with the organization's mission and goals?
Yeah, I like the thinking part in Think and Eat grants because we purposefully take a consulting perspective before we start writing. And I feel like that helps us like really get entrenched in an organization's programming, right? Helping them either design or redesign their program using a logic model. And to me, you can't get more intimate than that, right? So to me, it's intimately being involved in knowing their programming, asking those tough questions, and really defining what their outcomes are so that we can understand their overall impact. That's the first thing. The second thing, I love that Teresa said authentic relationships with funders. I love that because the cultivation process is really important to us as far as having those authentic connections, having those conversations, because it's oftentimes not about what they put on their website or even what's in the RFP, right? It's about unpacking, like, what do those words mean to you? Like, what do you mean when you're explaining these things? And what are you really wanting to get out of this opportunity? So I think combining intimately knowing a client's programming and having these authentic conversations with funders to understand what they're really looking to get out of the opportunity. Once those kind of connect, I call it a marriage, right? Like once that happens, it's all successful from there.
Wonderful. Thanks, Siobhan. All right, we are off to a great start. And Alice, I'll have you start us off with our next question. Can you share some effective strategies for building relationships with funders and maintaining those relationships over time?
I think that really piggybacking off of what the answers were in the first question, really connecting in with the funder on the mission and vision of what they're trying to do and what you're trying to do, and really connecting in with those solutions that you offer and resources that you're bringing to the table in addition to asking the funder for, but always leading and working within that cause that you're addressing and not the needs of your organization, but really demonstrating how your organization and this funder really share a vision of seeing something change in the community, and that's the way to really build and start that relationship.
Thanks, Alice. Teresa, over to you. What suggestions for developing relationships with funders and keeping them going long term?
Mhm. I agree about with Alice about the relationships. And, sometimes I find people are a little intimidated. They don't know what to say. How do we approach a funder, or should we even bother him? But funders are almost always they're an eager to help. They want to help. And I always try to emphasize there's a person on the other side of everything we do, whether it's a grant application, an email, a phone call, anything, there's a person. It's not an ATM machine, it's not a robot, it's a human being that cares about the cause they are working for. And so we need to connect with those people and show them that this cause is important to us. We know it's important to you. How can we collaborate and partner together to make a bigger impact on this specific problem? How can we make an influence and together have a lot bigger impact by pooling our resources? And so really it's connecting with the people and making sure that we're collaborating and using those resources effectively, and also approaching it of how can we serve you? How can we help you make your impact in the community too? It's not just a one-way thing, but how can we as the nonprofit help you as the funder to make a bigger impact on your mission? So really it becomes a great two-way relationship. And in long-term clients that I've seen do this and build this relationship over time, it's really a beautiful thing and becomes a tremendous collaboration that just helps programs grow and thrive. So it's pretty amazing once people can get over that initial fear of like contacting the funder. Really, like, it's amazing and it's very worthwhile.
Great. Siobhan, same question over to you. What tips can you give on forming relationships with funders and sustaining them over the years?
Yeah, I agree with Teresa. Funders give people give to people, right? It always amazes me when we're on funder calls with clients that they are just excited about our cause as we are. So we're in there like, oh, you're just as excited. This is great, right? And we feel all the synergies, right? I any advice I would give, I would say to me, go a path that everyone else isn't going, right? Like everyone will send an email, right? And we all know we're overloaded with email, right? But also don't be afraid to connect in in-person events. Don't be afraid to mail something. I always use this example when I was a program manager at Bank of America, where I received like a kid's card in the mail, like written in crayon, like "Thank you for helping our organization," and I really kept that. I put it on my wall, and I really kept it. So don't be afraid of doing things that are kind of outside what people would normally do. Mailing something. I have clients that show up at in-person events, and those in-person connections has been very worthwhile. So I would say take a chance and do things like that as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, Siobhan. Duranda, what would you like to add? What advice can you give nonprofits on building relationships with funders and how to keep them over time?
Yeah, these ladies took all my answers. So I really don't have anything else to add. I do suggest when you do get in front of that funder, asking them the questions that they aren't normally asked. I asked a funder one time, what are some programs or services that you all would like to fund, but you don't typically get requests for? So just like having a conversation with them, what do they want? Learning about them. I always tell people, approach them as a friend. Like it's not a one-way situation. It's not what you can always get out of it. And just having those great conversations that are genuine. You want to learn about the funder and what they want. And I have those like questions that aren't typically on websites, on the funder's website. 31 questions to ask grant funders that I'll share with clients and just people that are interested, that I do provide as a resource. But those are some things to really think about. I also like the lunch and learn. I worked at an organization. They did something where they would invite funders out to come and speak to students. We serve students 18 to 24 to get them job training credentials. And they would just talk to the students. They would like spend the day with the student, the day in the life with the student. They would walk side by side with them, see what their day was like, see what type of training and the courses that they were a part of. Of course, every funder is not going to come out for that, but there are some that will. So invite them to those opportunities at your organization, even your annual galas that you have or fundraising dinners. Invite them to those. Don't be afraid if they say no, that's fine. But there are some funders that would love to come out to those type of things. Like Siobhan said, they are just as excited about those type of opportunities, and they don't always get invited. So just open up your doors to funders. Again, they're people and they want to learn and hear about your organization.
Fantastic. Thanks, Deronda. Very quickly, I'd like to remind our live audience to start submitting your questions at any time, and we'll get to them on the second half of the session. All right, here's our next question. And Siobhan, I'll have you start us off with this one. How do you ensure that your grant proposal is competitive and stands out among other applicants?
I have to go back. It starts with the thinking part. It does. I've reviewed federal applications, and I can always tell the ones that did the work and the ones that didn't. So I would say, firstly, doing the work right. I would also say making sure that you're answering every part of the question, especially in federal grant applications. If you're not answering each part, if it says A and B, if you're only addressing A, you're not going to get the full points for that question. So, and everyone's shaking their head, they know, right? That's how you make sure you're competitive. And I would also say, lastly, really simple language to me is always good. Very simple sentences, very plainly spoken, straight to the point, to me would equal a competitive application.
Thanks, Siobhan. Deronda, on to you. Any advice on how to make sure that your grant proposal gets noticed?
Yes, absolutely. Stating the same thing Siobhan said. Those were killer tips, just being very simple and plain and easy to understand. That's one of the things I would say is my own personal strength, is taking complicated, complex material and just making it very simple, easy to understand. I always say, pretend like you're talking to a 9-year-old. In your grant application, it needs to be clear. These reviewers are looking at tons of applications. So it needs to be, very clear, easy to understand. And I think also what makes applications stand out, or applicants stand out, or nonprofits stand out, are those that have the uniqueness. Like we serve women, but we serve women that are domestic violence survivors. We serve youth, but we serve youth that have experienced like a traumatic loss of a parent or a sibling. We serve veterans that have maybe been diagnosed with mental health illnesses, like depression or PTSD. So how are you serving that specific population, a niche within a niche? Really highlight to make your program, your services stand out to funders. And again, there's a ton of after school programming. I use that example all the time, but how is yours unique and different? And a lot of times clients can't identify that, and I'm able to have those conversations with them, and we're able to come up with their uniqueness. A lot of nonprofits are, they have that unique thing about them. So making sure that you're highlighting that and really sharing that in your grant applications.
Thanks, Deronda. Alice, over to you. How can our nonprofits increase their chances of standing out and secure that funding?
Yeah, it's really hard to go third on this panel. Such great advice, but I really do like to treat each application like it's that education opportunity of kind of starting with the basics, like both Siobhan and Deronda said about, really educating them specifically about your organization and what you do, and keeping that at a very simple and easy to understand level. And then I also like to weave in stories and not only, answer the questions with data and resources and information that the funder wants, but tugging at their heartstrings a bit by weaving in stories of typical clients or, reviews of your services that you've gotten, and you can demonstrate how much of an impact you've made. So both of those things I think can make an application really stand out.
Wonderful. Teresa, we want to hear from you as well. What makes a grant proposal competitive and successful?
Mhm. Just to layer on everyone's responses, a couple of really practical tips. One is that I like to take any two sections, like most grants have typical sections. They want to know, why do you need these funds? What's the program going to be like? How are you going to use them? What are your goals? What's the budget? Pretty typical parts of every grant. If you were to pick up any two of those sections and compare them side by side, would they match of what you're saying you need and the money you're asking for, or your program design and the goals and objectives you're trying to meet? Can you cross-reference all those sections and everything matches up together? Or are you off in left field somewhere on the budget, like, oh, we also need a printer, let's throw that in? Is it tied to everything else you're doing? Is everything justified and it makes sense together? Or is it disjointed and doesn't quite flow? So really making sure things match up in a cohesive way. And then the other piece is just from a very practical standpoint, making sure that your writing is tight and compelling and using active language as opposed to, if we were awarded this grant, we would be able to do this and that. But how about with these funds, we will impact 500 students or whatever it is, but really packing a punch with your words. And you're saying the same thing, but just how can you drive it home and paint that compelling picture for them with clarity? Sometimes that's in the data you use and the way you present the data, the way you choose to really convey it. Are you saying 33% of something or one out of every three? Which way is going to just really make it like hit them in the heart, like, oh, wow, that's a lot. We could really impact this. So thinking that through for each piece of information that you're providing, it all needs to move the reviewer closer to a yes and to a compelling reason to fund you.
Thanks, Teresa. Deronda, here's our next question. What are some common mistakes or pitfalls that nonprofits make when seeking grant funding, and how can they be avoided?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, but I'll start with some of the ones that kind of stand out to me. Is going back to Teresa's point. I think it's so great what she said, how to communicate your application, how to communicate in your application, but starting with your evaluation plan and your budget. When I first started in grants, those were the two sections I hated. I'm like, I'm a writer. I just want to write and write beautifully and do all the fun things. But as time has gone by, I've noticed once you have a strong eval plan and a budget, that drives your application. It's so much easier to do once you have those items together. And I find those are the two sections that are the weakest for, nonprofits that may have need additional assistance with their programming. So they are typically challenged with how they're evaluating their programming. Of course, they jump right into providing the services and things of that nature because that's what they do well. But how are you evaluating your programming? What sets you all apart? What are the goals, the overall arching goal, long-term, short-term goals as far as your objectives, even on your outcomes, making sure you have all those things like laid out, and what are the data tools or methods that you're using to evaluate your program as well. Like thinking about all of these things, and a lot of this can be, done and fleshed out again if you seek professional assistance with that, and just get that done up front, and then you're able to go from there. But making sure that your budget makes sense, so what you're asking for and your budget aligns to your programming and the services.
Fantastic. Turning to you, Siobhan, what are some common mistakes nonprofits should avoid when seeking grant funding?
Where do I start? I think the biggest mistake that I see is sometimes we're all passionate as nonprofit leaders, right? We're passionate about what we do. And sometimes it's tough to step outside of that and think about what the funder wants. And I think the biggest mistake is not writing to what the funder wants, writing based on what you as an organization wants, what you want to do, which is good. It's good to include that, but you also have to include a way that you can pivot it to support what the foundation is looking for and making sure that that language is there and that approach is there so that when the foundation reads your proposal, they can say, wow, this project is very well aligned with what we're looking for. So it's about that alignment. I think sometimes as nonprofit leaders, so used to kind of spreading the message, right, and amplifying it, which is wonderful. But when you're doing it in writing and submitting a proposal, doing that, but taking a step back to make sure that you're also meeting the needs of the foundation.
Wonderful. Thanks, Siobhan. Teresa, on to you. When securing grant funding, what pitfalls should nonprofits avoid?
One thing I see pretty commonly is chasing the dollars just for the sake of there's money available, as opposed to let's find those good fit funders. Again, back to the mission, what funders are looking to do our kind of work in the community. The grant makers are not on the front lines for whatever reason, they don't have the capacity. That's not their role. They want to invest in nonprofits that are on the front lines doing the work. So look for those grant makers that are wanting to invest in your kind of work and your kind of influence in the community, as opposed to just chasing money for the sake of trying to get money. For one, that's not a great use of your time and energy and resources, but also it can damage your reputation with grant makers if they see that, oh, wait, they're just chasing, they're not trying to get to know us and what we're about. They're just after the money. They don't really care about this kind of mission. And so back to building the relationships and making sure that you're working together to serve them just as much as they're serving you to influence the community and making sure that it's that good fit back and forth. So I think it's important to really make sure that you've identified that and be able to work together to make the most impact. And that is a better use of your resources as well, to make sure that you're just honing in on those that really are doing the type of work that you want to do as well.
Fantastic. Alice, what would you like to add? What should nonprofits watch out for and how to avoid making these mistakes?
Yeah, so I want to kind of layer on as well, and kind of go back to something Siobhan said earlier when she got excited about a logic model, and talking about that logic model and how she helps organizations. But I think that that is a critical component of being able to measure the outcomes and how people will change because of your programs. And having that process by which you are measuring that and communicating that to the funder and demonstrating that your programs are having the impact that you want them to have, I think is really important and something that nonprofits can miss. And then the other part is kind of on the other side of the equation, just of when nonprofits see the word need sometimes, instead of thinking about the need in the community or in their target population, they automatically start thinking about their own needs. And so they start the whole conversation and they can start the entire grant application off, essentially with them being part of the problem, which we all know they're not part of the problem, they're part of the solution. So always making sure that you're looking external for that need, and that you're helping your community or a target population that you're serving, and not going on and on about what you need as an organization, because that's not what funders are there to support.
Wonderful. Thanks, Alice. All right. This is the last of my questions before opening it up to our wonderful audience. But before I open that door, I want to sneak in my final question. And Teresa, I'm going to have you start us off with this one. How do you measure and communicate the impact of your organization's programs to funders?
Mm. This is a great question, and one that's really important to consider before you need to do it. So a lot of nonprofits will start working on a grant application. There's a question about it, and oh, they want to know how many people we've served this year. Wait, let's see if we can backtrack and count it up. Instead, start thinking ahead now. What can we be tracking? What will show the impact? And not just vanity numbers like how many letters did we send out, but how much response was there? How many people have come in? How many families have we served? What kind of impact? And collecting the data, the numbers, so that quantitative piece, but then also the qualitative piece, the stories, the impact, the ones that just really tug at the heartstrings that drive home the change and the difference you're making in these lives. And so starting to collect that bank of stories over time will help you down the road, because then when you're working on a grant application, you've got that to pull from. You've been listening, you've been picking up those pieces to really show and put together that picture. It can't happen overnight, and it's really hard to backtrack. So I would say identify, based on the work you're doing, what external impact in the community are you making? And again, to your previous question, it's more about that external impact, not the internal, what do we need, but what does our community need? And so how are you tracking that? Identify that well before you need it and start tracking it all along. So then when the grant comes along, you've got the numbers and you're ready to go and you can present it well.
Thanks, Teresa. Alice, over to you. Thoughts on how to measure and show funders the impact of the organization's programs.
Yeah, so I think that each organization really needs to sit and think with kind of their own theory of change, like how do your participants change over a period of time. I like to use the model of kind of a usual skills and knowledge that people kind of learn something by working with our programs that leads to a behavior change that then leads to some sort of change in their condition or status out in the community. And so, really thinking through how is it that you move your participants from their baseline to a different set of circumstances, and walking through that process and setting up, like Teresa said, those measurements every step of the way so that you can really track over time how people change and what potentially, if they're not changing, what you can do differently.
Wonderful. Siobhan, you're up next. Any advice on how to measure and share success of programs to funders?
I hate to sound like a broken record, but I'm gonna use that magic phrase again, logic models. So in a meeting with a funder, I and or my client can literally say, these are the things that we have in the community that are going to support these activities that we're doing, activity A, B, C. As you're doing these activities, this is what we hope to create. And in creating those things, we want to make sure in the short term that we're accomplishing this thing, in the immediate term, this thing, long term, this thing, with an overall impact to do X, Y, Z. I just verbally walked, I don't know if you realize what I was doing. I just verbally walked us through a logic model, right? So if you have these things written down, if you've done the work, you can almost infuse it into your messaging and your conversations to walk a funder through exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to do it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Siobhan. And finally, Duranda, how do you let funders know how effective your programs are?
Yeah, and I was wanted to share that someone asked about how to get information or how to create an evaluation plan. I think Alice on our last session, she gave some really great advice on just Googling logic model or logic model plan for outcomes for veterans that are challenged with PTSD, or young women that have been victims of domestic violence, single moms that are trying to enter into new careers. Like literally just going in Google and seeing what information you pull up. Of course, you'll get something more rounded out or more professional if you do work with a professional. But don't let the logic model like intimidate you, but just really start off there. But even if you're not putting together a real official like logic model, just starting with anecdotes or testimonials or client success stories. I think Teresa mentioned that as well. A lot of times organizations will share this on their Facebook page or even on their website and not communicate it in the grant application. So really sharing like how is your work changing the trajectory of the lives of the individuals that you're serving. I think that's important to make sure that you're highlighting that. Again, making sure that you can infuse that in your grant application to measure the impact that you are, making a difference for the people that you're serving.
Thanks, Duranda. All right, we are officially opening up our Q&A portion. So let's start off with an audience question. And Duranda, I'm actually going to stick with you for the first question. Someone from the audience said, I would like to know what strategies you recommend for approaching the D&I requirements that are becoming part of every grant. We have a very robust program at our organization, but is there a way we can differentiate?
Yeah, so really understanding, depending on who you're asking or who's asking, how do they define DE and I? That's the first question. So what is it in terms of who is asking for that information? And just starting with collecting information internally, like your board, getting their background, demographic, and information, collecting that information on your staff, and then going into clients and having them self-identify their background, ethnicity, language spoken, and things like of that nature, and making sure that you're collecting that information and how are you serving them. And also the individuals that you're serving, are they a part of your program design? Are you designing a program that meets their needs, or is just something that you like, oh, this is what we think people need? So really making sure that you infuse them in a part of your program design. I worked at an organization, they received a ton of federal funding. And I think it was like a rule, like if you receive over like 50% or 70%, over 50% of your board had to be clients. So making sure that they're a part of the work that you're doing, to me, that's DE and I. So thinking about that overall and making sure that what you're providing and what you're giving to clients is what they truly need.
Wonderful. Anyone else want to add to that? Otherwise, we'll move on to our next question.
I do just want to say that I do really encourage people to include their participants in their design as well, because it is so critical that we do get that feedback from them so that we know that those approaches that we're proposing or doing are really going to meet their needs. And then just one other thing that I do think is really important is that kind of like if your DE and I is a program over here and your organization and programs are here, that's not what a funder is looking for, like that it's a separate program. It should be woven into the fabric of how your organization operates, and not some sort of separate initiative that you're doing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alice. All right. Teresa, here's a question from you for you in the chat. Do you have any advice to make the proposal different from other competitors when we are all applying to the same grant?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, especially when you are, you know, really trying. And if it's a small community, there are quite a few people applying for that smaller pool. So really making sure that you are tracking good data, telling those good stories, best practices. And the other piece, communicating with the funder. I can't emphasize that enough. That can really make all the difference. And I mean, sometimes just that little tweak. One time I was thinking for a food pantry, we would get food. When I talked to the funder, I found out that's not at all what they're looking for. And so we ended up getting a forklift for the food pantry. I never would have thought to ask for that, but they were looking for capacity building, efficiency building tactics. And so that was perfect. But if I hadn't contacted the funder, we would not have gotten the grant. So just really communicating, doing that homework, taking a few minutes up front to plan it out. And I believe it was Duranda that had emphasized planning up front, and that strategy beforehand, that can go a long way in making the process so much more successful and effective.
Thanks, Teresa. Siobhan, here's our next question. In the spirit of simplicity, if you have 1,000 words, do you try and use them all? What is the downside and upside to only using 500? Oh, you're muted.
I feel like a similar question came up during our last panel. So I would say as much as you need to say to get your point across. No reviewer wants to read just fluff added to meet 1,000 characters or words, right? When a funder gives a maximum of 1,000 characters or words, that is a maximum. It is not a limit that you have to reach. So I always say what you need to say to be very clear and descriptive and to the point, but don't feel like it has to be to the limit of what the funder provides.
Thanks, Siobhan. Alice, anything else you want to add? Otherwise, I'll have you start us off with the next question.
I agree with that. That is always, and it's always challenging. On the other side of the equation, when you're trying, you have so much to say and you have to narrow it down. I always found that to be quite a challenge of how do I get my most important points across when I have limited words compared to what I want to say. So that's I think always a challenge in the grant world, and I feel like funders have moved more in that direction of asking for more succinct, shorter applications. So we do have to use the words that make a difference and tell our story.
Thanks, Alice. I'll actually stick with you for this next question. What examples come to mind for how a capacity building nonprofit explained or demonstrated impact? Not providing direct services can be difficult to show the impact.
So I love this question actually because I before I started my business, did capacity building work for faith-based and community-based organizations. So capacity building projects are just so critical for us as nonprofits to help develop that structure. So I think that a lot of times when you are doing a capacity building project, you're usually sharing with the funder that what you're going to achieve with it is to develop that marketing plan or that volunteer recruitment plan or whatever it is you're trying to do. But the more that you can show that by having this volunteer recruitment and retention plan, you'll be able to serve this many more clients. Or, with that marketing, you'll be able to reach out to these new markets. So, how those capacity building projects will then impact your ability to provide services, I think is what a funder is really looking to see in those kinds of projects.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alice. Anyone else would like to add? Otherwise, we'll move on to our next question. All right. Duranda, here's our next question. Any opinions on a strong opening in a grant application when there's creative freedom?
So those type of creative freedom, believe it or not, they actually scare me when I don't have those limits. I think I just put in the chat like I actually like word limits. When I don't, I'm like, oh my God, what do I put in here? But again, just sticking to being succinct as possible. When I don't have those character limits, I kind of pretend like I do, and I keep it very succinct and clear, getting right into the point. I hate fluff. I just don't even like it. I don't like to write it, and I don't like to read it. So you can start off with a story of like impact initially. Or am I still here?
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Duranda. Oh, I think you're freezing. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. Teresa, I'll have you answer this question. How can your nonprofit's website help or hurt your grant chances? What are some do's and don'ts when it comes to your nonprofit's website?
I would say looking for congruency. Just like with the grant application, when I talked about do the sections match up and are they consistent? with your website, the message you're sending, your social media, your communications, your grant applications, is there congruency in what you're conveying? Is your messaging consistent? Does it look professional? Are you presenting a good image and a good representation of yourselves in the community? Is your mission clear? Is it clear, concise, compelling in everything that you're doing? If you asked someone, like say you asked your mom or a stranger off the street to come and look at your website and say, okay, based on this, what kind of work do you think we do? Could they clearly tell you? Or would they say, well, I don't know, I think you help puppies and maybe you feed people once a week and I'm not really sure. Like you mow yards? I don't know. Is it a mixed hodgepodge and they really don't know what you do? Or are they like, oh, I get it. You have a really cool after school STEM program for kids in this specific town. Like, is it so clear that they can immediately pick up on that impact and the work that you're doing? Or is it a hodgepodge? And sometimes it's just a few small tweaks. It doesn't have to be a major overhaul or a really expensive website project. It can just be some small tweaks to your messaging to start with. And then over time, you can refine it. But just knowing that websites are a work in progress. It's not like you're going to just build it. There it is. It's a castle. We can never touch it again. It's a constant refining. As your mission grows, as your organization grows, your website can grow with it.
Thanks, Teresa. Siobhan, here's our next question. I'm new to grant writing and my organization is currently building a grants department. What are some resources to find grants or funding opportunities?
I will say I often speak for instrumental, so I'm often biased. So I recommend instrumental as one resource. Alice, I often use Grant Station. Grant Station is another resource. Know that there are plenty of free resources that are available. Google is also a resource. Like, don't underestimate Google, right? That's a resource as well. I would say the main difference between paid resources and resources that are either free or have a trial for a period of time is that the paid resources, there's a little bit of a barrier to entry there. So everyone doesn't know of them. So maybe, I'm not saying absolutely, but perhaps in some cases, it may not be as competitive because it's not as well known. There's some foundations that don't even have websites that you can find in a system like GrantStation or Instrumental or even Foundation Directory, right? So um, if I was starting out, I would start with the free resources, try to build your funding up so that way you can afford to invest in some additional resources that you can find some other grant opportunities.
Wonderful. Anyone else would like to add to resources our nonprofits could tap into?
Yeah, I
And
just
to tap on, oh, sorry, to tap into that a little bit too, I always really encourage people to start local, to build those local community foundations, United Ways businesses locally, and then work your way up to the more national organizations or regional, just because they will want to see that you have that baseline support locally, that community support, and then you can work your way up into the different um, national and regional funders.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, if you're a local food pantry in your community, look who funds the larger the food bank. Like I know in DC, they have the Capital Area Food Bank, your local food bank in the DMV. See who funds them. It's on their website, public information. Check it out and start there. Just really have to do a lot of like bootstrapping in the beginning if you don't want to invest in some of the research platforms, initially, but definitely look to see your similar organizations doing similar work, who's funding them.
I have one more thing to add, Joanna. I don't know if you mentioned this in your remarks, but I remember, I don't know if this is still happening, that you used to be able to go to your local library and access Foundation Directory. Again, I don't know if this is still a thing, but I remember when I started my nonprofit very early on, we had no money, right? I would make that trip. Like one day, I would just like dedicate 4 or 5 hours using, my library card, and they would have me sign in on a computer, and I would just email myself some listings. So again, I don't know if that's still a thing. It's been some years, but if you all want to kind of check your local resources to see if that's still a thing. But I remember at that time you could have access to public libraries.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing, Siobhan. All right. Unbelievably, the hour is going by so quickly. So we're going to wrap up this portion of the panel so we can stick to our schedule. I've had such a wonderful time hearing from our panelists today, and I'm hoping to get one final piece of insight from all of them. And Siobhan, I'll have you start us off with this question. What do you see as the future of grant writing, and how can nonprofits get ahead today?
A lot of conversation has been going on about AI in the grant world, right? And I know everyone has their own opinions about that. I am of the belief where I'm just kind of seeing how this will go. I've seen the benefits of AI in kind of different areas, especially in like marketing and social media. I've seen those benefits. I'm still waiting to see how that'll impact the grant profession. So maybe if you ask that question in a future panel, I'll probably have a more solid answer. But I know that's on the radar, and people have opinions. But I am more of a let's see. I'm waiting to form my opinion. So that's my thought.
Thanks, Siobhan. We'll definitely have that in the future. All right, Deronda, thoughts on the future and how to get ahead today?
Yeah, I think nonprofits that stand out are the ones that are ahead, are the ones that are make their staff their priority. It's so rare that you see nonprofits that value their staff, treat them with dignity and respect. I worked in an organization where the ED said, "My staff is my number one. Clients are wonderful, are important. Stakeholders, donors are important, but my staff is my number one stakeholder. When they're happy and healthy, clients are served best." When it's not a challenge or issue or drama for a staff member to take a couple of days off of vacation, it's those small things, which are big things, are make a difference. So I think your nonprofits that are ahead of the game, that are excelling and doing well, are those that value and treat their staff well. So those to me are your thriving nonprofits. Those are the ones that are growing and elevating. So just to be a nonprofit, especially if you're just getting started out, really keep that in mind in the forefront and just treat your staff very well, and they'll stick with you.
Wonderful. Alice, what do you see as the future and how to get ahead today?
I think that one thing that's really important is that nonprofits, as they are establishing and then even growing and that sort of thing, is that they are thinking about their sustainability. That I would often have people call me up and say, I just started my nonprofit and I'm going to be funded on grants, and that's my strategy. And, it's doable, but it's a lot of hard work, right? And so you really do need to be thinking about the other, ways that you can get funding, if it's earned income streams or social enterprises or partnerships, etc., where grants aren't the only way that you're trying to fund your organization. And if you start out looking at those sustainability strategies, I think it's going to make you a stronger organization that's going to thrive more in the future.
Thanks, Alice. Teresa, thoughts on the future of grant writing and how to get ahead today?
I so agree with all my colleagues here, and I think we all know the importance of that. And, of course, AI and some of the technology is on the forefront, and the tools coming out there. I think really the key there, the ones that thrive are the ones who will move forward and lean in and at the same time use it wisely as a tool to advance your work, but not recklessly and not without setting some good guidelines and ethical boundaries around the technology, because it can really free up time for the more strategic pieces. But we also have to be discerning about how we're using it and what kind of information we're feeding it to be sure that we are using our resources and stewarding that responsibility well of protecting our constituents and yet also protecting our staff and our people on the front lines. How can we best provide for them? And then also at the same time, I as much as technology is becoming a thing, nothing will ever replace the human relationships. And I know that's been a common theme this whole hour, but really coming back to that. And again, the ROI framework that I had talked about in my TED Talk was building the relevance of the work you're doing in the community, the work that your community needs and also that grant makers are doing, the optimization to make sure that you are running smoothly, that your operations are professional and efficient as possible, and then the relevant interactions with authenticity. So when you get that relevance, optimization, and interaction, that's the ROI that leads to the return on impact. So it's those nonprofits who lean into the process and approach it that way as opposed to the ones that are fearful and scarcity and, oh, we can't change, I don't know, we can't invest in our staff. Those are not going to thrive. It's the ones who truly lean in, take care of their people, build the relationships, use the resources around them, and collaborate and approach it with a collaborative mentality. Those are the ones who will thrive. So I think that's what it comes down to, is just really using what's around us and stewarding those resources well.
Thanks, Teresa. And with that, we have reached the end of our panel. I want to give a big thank you to our panelists for sharing their insights today. I also want to give a big thank you to our audience. Thank you so much for your time. Hope you enjoyed yourself and learned something that will benefit the work that you do on a daily basis. We have a packed spring of panels ahead of us, and I hope you will join us for them. We will have more grant panels to come, panels on CSR, capacity building, and so much more. So keep an eye out on the NXUnite website or on the NXUnite LinkedIn page, and so you don't miss out on any of these. Also, if you're already taking time out of your day to join us, I highly recommend that you create a free NXUnite account. That way, you can begin earning what we call cost coins, which can be redeemed for discounts on industry software and consultations with some of our friends in the industry. All right, that is it for me. Once again, thank you all for joining us and have a nice rest of your day. Bye.